Hi, my name is Lori Mackenzie. I am the Executive Director of the Clayman Institute for Gender Research at Stanford University and the co-founder of the new Women's Leadership Innovation Lab. And one of the first questions I get is, what is a Women's Leadership Innovation Lab and what is gender research? So what we do at Stanford University is we try to create models of change. What kind of research do we need to investigate and find out that helps us get underneath why problems exist and then work with people in organizations to create solutions? And this is the third time Celia and I have presented together, so I'm going to enjoy it, I think, as much as you'll enjoy hearing from her as well.
Oh, thank you. Okay, how about now? No. I might need some help. All right, how about the folks in the back? Can you guys hear me without a mic? Let's start that way. Okay, so I'm Celia Huber. I'm a senior partner at McKinsey Company. I've been with the firm for 26 years. Most of my daytime job is serving clients, and I serve clients in the insurance and healthcare industries. But I also spend a bit of time working on diversity because it's a personal passion of mine. And over time, I've been responsible for our North American efforts on diversity and inclusion. And now I occasionally get to collaborate with Lori to share some of our research. So what we thought we'd do today is I'm going to share a bit of our research. Lori's going to share a bit of the Clayman Institute's research. And then we're going to have a little bit of a coffee chat without the coffee on focusing on how to make change happen within companies. I am going to start to show you a few slides of our research. So we thought we divided this into four basic questions. What's the current level of corporate diversity? So let's start with the facts. Where do we stand today? Sally referred to a little bit of this. We're not making much progress, and I wanted to show you what that looks like. What do the experiences of specific groups tell us? And so this year, we divided our survey not just into gender, women and men, but also into different racial and ethnicities, and also looked at sexual orientation. So one of the things that came out is the experience of being the only person like yourself in your company, in the room, and how that feels, and what we can do to help be more inclusive of those folks. What's happening at the micro level? So Lori's going to talk about how the meritocracy gets implemented on a micro level within companies and the psychological research behind bias and what to do about that. And then we'll come back to some tips and tricks on how to promote diversity in companies. So because you all work with numbers, let me just start with the numbers behind our research. This is the fourth year we've been doing research. It's called Women in the Workplace. It is in collaboration with leanin.org. And as I mentioned, it now covers more than women. We have 279 participating companies. And that's really important because those companies open up their books to us on what their pipeline looks like, where their diverse groups are in terms of their promotion rates, and also allow us to do a survey. So this represents about 13 million employees in the US, and we had 64,000 people complete our survey. Again, men, women, people of color, and self-identified folks based on their sexual orientation completed the survey so that we can do some comparisons of how they feel about working in their company and how they view the workplace fairness and ability to get promotions. So let's start with the current level of corporate diversity. Now, this is a pretty busy chart, so let me just start with the basics. We have played across the top from entry level, manager, director, or senior manager, all the way up through the C-suite. And we asked those companies that participated to give us the number of people at each of those levels. Across the 279 companies, what you see if you look at the bottom, because we did a cut by gender, 48% at the entry level are women. And as you work your way up through the pipeline, you get to the C-suite, 22% at that level are women. This drop-off is pretty typical across industries. I will tell you that the drop-off in healthcare is worse. Entry level is 70%, one of the highest entry level of women in any industry. And at the tail end, we see about 30% in the C-suite. You guys are all in asset management, so I looked up the asset management and investment management numbers. Folks start at, 46% women at the entry level, goes down to 19% by the time you get to the C-suite level. We also looked at women of color more particularly, and you can see the women of color, that's the hashtag part of the pipeline, starts at about 17%, and by the time you get to the C-suite, probably no surprise to this room, is down to 4%. And so this notion of promotion at each level is very important. Now, many people see this chart and they say, well, that's because women are opting out before they get to this promotion. It is really attrition. And we've looked at attrition 8 ways to Sunday. This is not attrition. This is the promotion level, and in particular from entry level to manager, manager to senior manager. And so let me show you some numbers on that. The first driver is women falling behind. And even in the first promotion, we see that women are 21% less likely to be promoted to that first level manager. It's worse for Black women, 40% less likely to be promoted to that first level. So one of the things that we'll talk about that companies can do is think about how to ensure that folks are getting an equal opportunity at that first level. These pipelines, numbers, they really create an experience in the workplace that is very difficult for folks in diverse groups. And so I wanted to just talk a little bit about the experiences of specific groups and how those play out. So one of the questions we ask is whether people think the workplace is fair. And the biggest sample we have is gender. So we split the sample by men and women. And 24% of women think that their gender has played a role in missing out on a raise, promotion. And actually our research would say it's more than probably the 24% that feel it. And only 8% of men. The same thing is true about the raises and promotion and get ahead over time. And so 29% of women believe that their gender makes it harder. Only 15% of men after they're in the pipeline that we talked about. As we look at the group of people who submitted this survey, we did make a distinction about being an only. And I want to talk to you a little bit about how we defined an only. So 20% of women said that they were the only women in the room most of the time. 45% of color said that they were the only. And 70% of lesbian women and gay men said that they were one of the onlys. This is a more common experience. Obviously, the more senior you go up the pipeline. And so senior women and people of color, as well as women in technical roles, said that they were 40% likely to be the only. Okay, so for most of you here in this room, that's not a big surprise. All of us have been the only in a room at some point in time. But why does it really matter? And so we asked a few questions about how it feels to be the only in a room. And let me just give you some of the numbers even before we get to this chart. 49% of folks that we designated only versus 32% of the non-onlys feel that their judgment is questioned on a regular basis in their work. 35% are mistaken for someone more junior. This happened to me last night. Someone thought I was a brand new associate at McKinsey. Unfortunately, it was one of my summer interns, so it was a little awkward for her, but it worked out okay. And then 24% say that they're subjected to demeaning comments. Well, that really matters because the onlys say that they're more likely to leave and they're more likely to be looking for a job. So you've spent all your time as a company to recruit someone who falls into one of these diverse groups. You're really excited. You're improving your pipeline. But then you put them in an environment that makes them want to look for another job almost all the time. So some of the details on this chart, the women who said that they were an only versus the men who said that they were an only, which is an interesting dichotomy, said that they were under more pressure to perform. They were more likely to be on guard, more likely to be left out. And as you look across the research, you can see how that pipeline then plays out into the feeling in the workplace of collaboration and the lack of inclusion. So recognizing the problem, and we believe this firmly, is the first step to dealing with it. And we'll talk about keeping track of the metrics of diversity in companies and which companies are doing that. In the companies that are the worst at the senior level, so less than 10% of senior people being women, nearly 45% of the men in those companies think representation is just fine. They are happy with the status quo, it's okay. And remarkably, close to a third of the women agree that it's fine. So part of this needs to be changing our expectations on what our aspiration for diversity really is. We also interview the heads of HR and CEOs to be one of the 279 companies in our data set. And 84% of what we're calling the company representatives, CEOs or chief HR officers, said diversity is really important, and they would say gender diversity is a priority for them. But most of the employees in those companies say that it's not a priority, and in fact would say that the commitment to diversity feels like lip service. There's a large portion of the group that would say, my company's not really delivering on that commitment to diversity. And so it's not just about having the commitment and taking some of the actions, but also being visible about the commitment and then the actions that you're taking. So before I just close off on the research, we've done this over 4 years, and Sally was talking about, diversity is not improving, and that is really true. Diversity is not improving. However, at the top tier of companies, the top 25% of companies in our data set, what we found was that the inbound recruiting and that first level promotion, that critical promotion that I talked to you about, is happening at proportionate rates moving forward. So men, women, people of color are equally likely to get promoted. And that is new, that we had not seen that in our data set in the previous 3 years. And so I would just leave you with, there is hope. I don't want to leave you with a negative story. And there are lots of things that companies can do if they put their mind to it. And with that, let me turn it over to Lori.
Thank you. Whenever I hear data like the data that Celia presented, I always ask, well, what's going on? Why would it be that companies who obviously know the value of their employees are hiring them and then creating conditions where they might inadvertently not feel valued in those very same organizations? So the research that we do is trying to understand not only what's happening in our brains that makes this happen, but what are managers doing every day? So the goal of our combined is to create a lens for you to see how to create change. Even if your company does not yet have a diversity inclusion effort, we as individuals, no matter where we sit in an organization, so Stanford University is a pretty big place, and my span of control might be about this big, or maybe this big. Even in that little span of control I have, I can enact all of these practices so that the employees that work for me feel included and valued in everything they're doing. So this is a chance for us to move beyond looking at just the data and just the experiences, but at the end, we're going to talk about solutions that each and every one of us can do. But first, we're going to give you a lens. What is happening in our organizations at the micro level that has our employees that we hired not be valued in our workplaces? Well, at our research organization, one of the things we look at are what are the narratives? What are the narratives we tell each other about why things are the way they are? And do those very narratives inadvertently prevent us from finding the solutions we need to debug our processes and do better? Well, one of those narratives that's alive and well is called meritocracy. Now, notice the way I've defined meritocracy in this slide is an ideal. It's an ideal that each and every person is exactly seen and valued for the contributions they bring to our organization. But here's the challenge. We know from research that if we believe we've already achieved a meritocracy, we as individual managers inadvertently open the door to being more biased. Now, how does that work? Some researchers wanted to understand what it would take to create a true meritocracy in their organizations. So they worked with an 8,000 person organization and they asked them, if you were going to work towards achieving a meritocracy in your organization, what are some of the things you would do? And this organization said, here's what we do. For salary increases, we would weed out managerial discretion. We wouldn't let managers give more bonuses or more salary increases to people they liked. We would go through a process. We would have each manager exactly rate their employee very carefully, and then salary increases would only go to employees based on those ratings, not whether I liked you or I know you or I feel comfortable with you. So this company worked really hard and calibrated their employees and resulted in what they thought was the fairest salary increases they've ever done. Then they told those very same managers, time to give out merit bonuses, the one-time bonuses you might get. And they collected the data on the merit bonuses, and here's what they discovered. Performance ratings had very little to do with who got more or less of a bonus. Gender and race determined who got what bonus in that organization. And they call this finding the paradox of meritocracy. When managers work for what they believe is a meritocratic organization, they, as individual managers, stop scrutinizing their own behavior and inadvertently open the door to enacting biases themselves. So this is why it's called the paradox of meritocracy. It is something we strive toward by debugging what's wrong in our processes versus assuming we're already there and accidentally opening the door to bias. So I'm going to start discussing how bias works in our cognitive function with this optical illusion. Has anyone seen this before? Yes. Has anyone seen it before and you still can't tell it's an optical illusion? That's my category, okay. Now, does anyone think squares A and B are shades of gray, dark gray and light gray? Just raise your hand. Dark gray and light gray. Maybe white and gray. How about exactly the same color? Right. Remember I said it's an optical illusion? Exactly the same color. Now, why might we have thought it was gray and gray or gray and white? Well, your brain knows things. Your brain knows that checkerboards go dark, light, dark, light. Your brain knows this. Your brain knows how shadows work. So because we're amazing at categorizing things, our brain sees what it expects to see, not what's actually there. And bias works in exactly the same way. Like an optical illusion, when you see someone's performance, it will look better or worse than it actually is based on bias. Now, how does that work? I'm going to show you an example about a work product. It might be easy to understand that maybe in an interview I gravitate towards someone or not gravitate towards them, but really should that be an impact? Should it have an impact on how we evaluate the quality of somebody's work? Isn't work product a work product no matter who produces it? Well, these researchers wanted to get underneath that. So what they did was they created a work product, a legal brief. And they said, let's put some mistakes in it. Some spelling mistakes, grammatical mistakes, theoretical mistakes, analytical mistakes. And they sent it out to law partners and said, would you help this third-year law associate do better at writing legal briefs, knowing that there are mistakes in it. And in the cover letter with this request, they subtly mention a few things about Thomas Meyer, including half of the law partners think Thomas Meyer is black, and half of the law partners think Thomas Meyer is white, and that is the only difference. Exact same legal brief. Again, it's a work product. Should that impact how we evaluate a work product? And the answer is, it does. Because like an optical illusion, it colors what we see comes next. They are twice as likely to find the mistakes when they think Thomas Meyer is black. So think about markers of success in a law firm. There are not as many black male law partners. They don't seem like the kinds of people we've seen succeed here, so they put him through increased scrutiny. Can you see that? Same product, increased scrutiny. Not only that, so some people say to me, well, Lori, maybe they know because there's so few black law partners, they're giving him more help to help him succeed against an uneven playing field. That might be the case, except they rate him lower. Exact same legal brief, white Thomas Meyer gets a 4.1 and is told he has potential. Black Thomas Meyer gets 3.2 and can't even believe he went to NYU. So you can hear how, like an optical illusion, our stereotypes about people and whether those stereotypes align with what we think success is puts people through unnecessary and increased scrutiny. And in a meritocracy, here's what I'd say. Hire the 4.1 Thomas Meyer. Clearly, he's a better performer. If I'm not thinking we've already achieved a meritocracy, I might question the evaluation process that produced the differential outcomes. But if I already believe I'm in a meritocracy, I would just hire the one with the better score. So this is how it works in our everyday interactions. We see data, someone looks better than somebody else, we ask them to join us in a critical assignment with a key client. Because of that, they get visibility to our senior leaders, and over time, that person who had a little bit of advantage in the beginning because of a work product like this ends up on a pathway to be in the C-suite, while the other person who produced the exact same quality result is put on a different track. So it turns out our very definitions of success play out in our cultural context. So this is just a Google image search. Now, this might reveal a little bit too much about how I think, but whenever I wonder what a stereotype is like, I just do a Google image search. I wonder what this term investment advisor would reveal to me what the stereotype of success is in our industry. I've done this with CEO, I've done it with medical researcher, I've done it with a number of fields. It's not a perfect analysis, but it kind of reflects our cultural expectations about who is successful of something. And whenever someone looks more like what success looks like, they get less scrutiny, and they get seen sometimes as better than they really are. So this is what you see when you look at investment advisor. I've looked at other financial asset manager. I've looked at a number. I've looked at CIO, CFO, a number of terms. It's very interesting. When you want to, you can at some time do this as well. It's very fun, especially if you work at a research institute. But here's what I saw. In just a Google image search, we see 14 men, 3 women, and 4 people of color. So these are the stereotypes that we live through every day that, like an optical illusion, are having some people's performance look better and some people's performance look worse than it actually is. Now, how does this work in research? Because these are well-intentioned managers thinking they're reproducing meritocracy and accidentally creating an unlevel playing field. What's happening? One, the very standard by which we evaluate people will shift. Like that work product, we'll be looking for maybe confirmation that someone is as good as we think they are or is not as good as we think they are, putting them through increased scrutiny. Now, one of the questions I often get, and thank you, someone at breakfast asked me this question as well, is, Does the gender or race of the person doing the evaluation affect the outcomes? And the answer is no. Men and women are as equally likely to rate the exact same male candidate higher. Now, around race, it can be harder because there aren't as many, for example, Black law partners to do an equal analysis. But just because you look like the person being evaluated doesn't mean over time that you have stopped absorbing our cultural stereotypes like that Google image search. When I see that Google image search, I can't just look for the people who look like me. I look at everything, and that affects how I evaluate people over time. Now, you will never get a side-by-side performance evaluation. You will never get a side-by-side, two exact same resumes with different names. But here's what you will get. You'll hear that increased scrutiny among just one person in your organization. So we know from research as well that stereotypes will make us scrutinize one person's performance more than another based on whether they match our markers of success. So in your interviews, in your calibration meetings, in everything you do, you will not have a side-by-side, but there will be one person, or maybe two, who get all of the extra questions. Did she really bring in that client on her own, or was it handed to her? Were they just in the right market at the right time, or are they good analysts, right? So one person for the exact same qualifications will get a lot of scrutinizing, trying to understand it. And that's now your clue that maybe you should go back to finding ways to block that so everyone does indeed get a fair shot in our organizations. Now, some people ask me, does this play out more in one people process or another? It plays out in everything that we do, from the very way we write job ads to the way we then interview people, evaluate them. That extra scrutiny or higher bar is happening every time that we evaluate whether somebody is prepared for an assignment, should be brought into our team, or even listened to in a team meeting. So that's a lot of the data. Now, Celia and I are going to take a little time to fireside chat and walk you through some of the key solutions of what each and every person can do to block bias in their organizations.
Thanks, Lori. All right, so we've boiled it down to 6 things, and Lori and I thought we'd at least talk about the first 3 in the few minutes we've got left. The first is about getting the basics right. And so I talked a little bit about just measuring diversity and holding people accountable. The second is ensuring that promotions and hiring are fair. Lori talked about the biases that go into that, and we have some ideas on how to make sure that it is more fair. The third is making sure senior leaders are really champions of diversity. This notion of it is important, but making sure that we're really walking the talk on making it happen. The fourth is about being inclusive and respectful of culture. You know, we talked a lot about the onlys, and so some of the things you can do about inclusivity. Making the only experience very rare. So instead of just making the environment more inclusive, can we actually put more people in cohorts together so that they don't feel like the only? And then the notion of having work being much more flexible to fit into people's lives. So things like telecommuting, on-site daycare, that can make it easier for everyone to fit their full self into the workplace as well. So why don't we talk a little bit about the first piece, about getting the basics right. So a number of companies think that this is really important, yet they will say that they are holding no one accountable for this. Roughly half the companies we survey say that they are holding no one accountable for this as a metric. And so that's pretty amazing. Oh, now, why does that happen? Well, first, because they haven't developed a real case for change. And what's the business case of having more diversity? So we think that that's really important. The second is about tracking metrics, both at every level, like I showed you, and then gender, and at a minimum, you know, the basics would be gender and race. We think that diversity has a lot more dimensions than that, but at a minimum, starting with gender and race.
And I know this is really small, so many companies track representation. About 96% track gender, close to 90% track race. A lot of times they don't track the intersection of gender and race. Only half the companies do that, which is kind of interesting. And then as you get down to setting any targets, what's the aspiration then for diversity? Roughly 38% actually have an aspiration or target for gender, and the majority don't share that diversity scorecard with their employees. So there's no conversation about how we're doing against those metrics. And while roughly 40% hold senior managers responsible, very few hold managers, middle managers, first line managers responsible for gender diversity, only 16%. And you can see how that plays out in the pipeline.
How
What
many
else would you
people
say?
here have actually seen their statistics in their organizations? Does anyone see them? That's great. And have you ever required that of a company that contracts with you or that manages your assets and said, can I see yours? And so this is part of the way that we can move it from being something that's reported to something that's actually making a difference in the conversations and holding people accountable.
Should we move on to the second one?
Sure.
Ensuring that hiring and promotions are fair.
So one of the things I often talk about is a rubric. Now, this might be a term that's less familiar, but if anyone has somebody who's in elementary school or high school, you might have heard this term. So what a rubric is that teachers get a question. How do I get a perfect score on my homework paper? And they, instead of having to explain it over and over again to every student, they create a rubric, which is, here's the thesis statement. An excellent thesis statement looks like this, and the bare minimum to have a thesis statement looks like this. It turns out what a rubric does is it not only helps the student understand what they need to do, it holds the teacher accountable for not being biased by the name, gender, or race of their students. This is something all of us can do. It turns out, remember we talked about the shifting criteria? When you hold the criteria steady, I'm not asking you about your clients and you about your analysis and you about something else. We're looking at everyone with the same criteria. You're less likely to let that bar go. And I'm going to show you a rubric. Is Lloyd Metz here? You would have seen this. This is from the School of Engineering at Stanford University. Chemical engineering, as you can imagine, not a super diverse field, and yet they were really committed to doing better. So they created this scorecard. So I'm not saying this is the perfect scorecard, but isn't it interesting that at the School of Engineering, there were only 3 criteria for success? 1, what is your scholarly contribution? 2, what have you done to diversify the field? So not are you diverse yourself? Have you mentored diverse students? Do you have programs that make things fair? And the third one was communication. Again, this isn't that this is the perfect one, but isn't it interesting that you can include what you've contributed as a key criterion for interviewing people? And if you use this rubric consistently, people won't be asked different questions and evaluated on different scores. And the last one is a work test. Do you remember that thing I did with the legal brief? That's actually a work test. You could figure out how not to let the resume be the only thing that influences you. So Atlassian was really interested in these kind of blind audition ideas and did it themselves. They created a computer programming test and they had their managers evaluate them, and they noticed that once the managers found the gender of the applicant, it shifted who got a better evaluation and score. So what they did in their org is they took those tests and switched the names on them. And then they showed the managers how their score shifted based on the shift in names. And that allowed them to break their belief that they already were a meritocracy, to be more consistent in how they used these work tests, and as a result, boosted their technical hires. So about 18% of undergraduate degrees are in CS in the United States. They significantly increased their technical hires.
We've done this also at McKinsey. So we hire 1,800 people every year in North America. And I think that accounts for something close to 800,000 online applications. So out of necessity, we moved away from having people screen, of which we would end up with about 30% women in our inbound classes. And we started having a computer program screen the resumes. And we ask a few other questions on the application. And in that, we now, on the West Coast, have 60% of our inbound class being women. And we're getting very close to 50% in the rest of the country. And it was interesting because we had thought, but gee, most of our recruiters who do that job are women, so they would not have the bias. And we've given them targets to have a diverse slate of candidates. So how is this happening? Well, it's happening exactly the way that Lori described. So ironically, by getting more scale and being forced to go to a more computerized screening mechanism, we actually did a lot better on diversity. We wanted to cover one more thing before we run out of time. Let's see. So thinking about making senior leaders champions of diversity. And most senior leaders would say, but I am a champion of diversity. Our own survey shows that. So what does that really mean? We found that that can include 3 different things that make a big difference. Training leaders, having some of the conversation that Lori had about unconscious bias can be really important, particularly to the first line managers who are making some of those promotion decisions. The second is choosing diversity champions. So involving those leaders in shaping the diversity and inclusion strategy. And the last is having some formal programs, sponsorship, the accountability that I talked to before. And when we look at managers' roles in particularly that promotion and thinking about walking the talk, most men say gender diversity is important for my manager, but most women do not, right? So roughly half of the men say that it's true. Less than 40% of the women say it's true. But that my manager has provided any guidance on how to improve gender diversity, only a third of the men say that that's true, and only 22% of the women. So we learn a lot about management skills and leadership. One of the things that we don't teach our managers consistently is this notion of how to promote diversity, how to create an inclusive team environment. And so we should think about this as one more skill that we want to pass along to our first line managers. And many of the companies we're working with have done this, and it's made a huge difference to that first and second level promotion that I talked about in the pipeline.
And sometimes people ask, what are the most important things that happen around mentorship and sponsorship? And one of the things I'll tell you about variance is it turns out we tend to give different kinds of feedback to people who are not like us. So that could be due to protective hesitation. I'm not as sure how it's going to land, so I'm going to pull back, I'm going to be hesitant, and maybe give more vague feedback, maybe some more vague praise to avoid what might feel uncomfortable in how it's going to be received. So as a mentor and sponsor, as a manager, one of the things you can do, like a rubric, think about the feedback you're giving men and women. In looking at performance evaluations, it turns out women get vague feedback. They're often coached on communication skills, but not on technical skills. And over time, this can mean gendered pathways for people in our organizations.
There's one last comment I'd just like to make about inclusion, and we talked about being the onlys. One of the main things that can make someone feel alone is when they get those demeaning or harassing comments, and roughly 30% of the women said that in their company, when they see demeaning comments, not necessarily to themselves, but to a diverse group, only 32% said that they're dealt with immediately. And only 50% of the men said that they're dealt with immediately. So part of this is just having your radar up as a manager and being able to address that. So we talked about a lot of things that are important within companies, and you guys all operate with a lot of companies. So hopefully we've given you a set of questions that you might be able to ask. If you're interested in diversity, asking the leaders of those companies, are you doing this or how do you think about that? Just to give you some clues, not just on the numbers, but also how the practices within that company can support diversity and inclusion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.